The notice had been tacked to the post office board for 11 days before she read it. She had walked past it each morning on her way to the mill office where she kept the accounts, and each morning she had not read it, the way you do not read certain things when you are not yet ready to know what they say. On the 12th day, the tack came loose and the paper fell, and she picked it up off the floor and read it standing there with her coat still buttoned. A man in the Quappel Valley was looking for someone to help manage a household and assist with the running of a wheat operation. The work was year-round, the situation honest. He had written it himself, she could tell. There was no flourish to it, no attempt to make the thing sound like more than it was. He needed help, he said so plainly. If the arrangement suited them both, he was open to a permanent arrangement. He had written that last part the way a person writes something they have thought about for a long time and decided to say only once. She stood with the paper for a moment, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket, and walked to the window and looked out at the street. The sky above the valley was the particular white of February in the Northwest Territories, flat and without gradation, the kind of sky that tells you nothing about what is coming. She was 28 years old. She had come to this town 14 months ago with a sister who had since gone back east to marry a man in Hamilton, and she had stayed because leaving felt like a decision, and she had not been ready to make one. She had spent 3 years before that in a place she did not think about directly anymore. There had been a man there, and then a child, and then neither, and in the time after she had learned to organize her life around what she could manage and to stop reaching toward what she couldn't. She had become very good at accounts. She was precise with numbers in the way that people become precise about things. When imprecision has cost them something, they cannot afford to lose again. She wrote back to the address at the bottom of the page that evening. His reply came 10 days later. It was shorter than the advertisement. He would be in town the last Saturday of the month. If she could come to the livery stable on Railway Street at 9:30, he would bring the wagon and they could drive out, and she could see the land before she decided anything. He wrote, "You should see it before you decide." She read that twice. Most men did not think to say that. The last Saturday of the month was cold, in the way February in the Territories is cold when the wind comes north off the open plain without anything to interrupt it. She wore her heavy wool coat and her boots with the extra lining she had sewn herself, and she was at the livery at 9:20. He was already there. He was tending to one of the horses when she arrived, adjusting the harness with the concentrated attention of someone who does not like things imprecise. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. The cold made ages difficult to read. He was tall in the way of men who have spent years bending into work and have kept the strength of it without the stoop. He turned when she came through the door and looked at her for a moment in the way she was beginning to understand was simply his manner. Not assessment of the kind she had learned to brace for, but attention. Genuine and without agenda. He said, "You're the one who wrote." She said, "I am." He said, "The roads are icy past the creek crossing. It'll take closer to 2 hours than 1. She said that was fine. He did not make anything of it. He finished with the harness and helped her up onto the wagon bench with one hand, and then climbed up himself, and they drove out of town into the white morning. The land opened immediately past the last buildings. It did what prairie land does in winter, which has become enormous and indifferent and very honest. There was nothing to hide behind out here. The sky sat directly on the earth at every horizon, and the road ran straight between drifts that had crusted over with the overnight cold. She watched it all. She had grown up in Nova Scotia, on the coast, where the land was broken and particular, and you always knew where you were in relation to the water. This was different. The scale of it was something you had to decide about. He did not talk for the first half hour. She did not fill the silence. After a time he said, "It was my father's quarter before it was mine. He broke the first 40 acres in 1883. I've been adding to it since." She said, "How much now?" He said, "320. I've got 2 more quarters I took on last spring. I haven't touched them yet." She thought about that. A man who takes on land he hasn't yet touched, either careless or far-sighted. She had not yet decided which. He said, "The house is sound. The barn needs work on the north wall. I know that. I've been meaning to get at it since October and I haven't." She said, "What stopped you?" He was quiet a moment. He said, "Same thing that stops most things. Not enough hands and the day's going shorter." She nodded. She looked at the road ahead. She said, "What happened to the last person who helped with the house?" He said, "There wasn't one. I managed alone since my wife." She let that land. She said, "How long ago?" He said, 2 years this April." She did not offer anything back. He had not asked. The farm came into view when they crested a low rise, the kind of rise the prairie makes without effort, barely perceptible until suddenly you are above something. She saw the house first, then the barn, then the grain building standing in a line to the east. There were 2 smaller outbuildings. Everything was white with snow and still under the flat sky. The proportions were right. Whoever had built the barn had known how large a barn needed to be, had not guessed at it or built small and added on haphazardly. It sat square and certain in its place. He pulled up at the rise the way she would later learn he always did, pausing before he came down to it. Not hesitation, something more considered. She wondered if he needed the moment to see it as it was, rather than as what it had been. She said, "The barn's well sited." He said, "My father put a good deal of thought into it." She said, "How much of the 320 is under cultivation?" He said, 240. The 2 new quarters are unbroken. That's the problem. She looked at the field lines visible under the snow. The rows were straight. Someone had taken care with them. "What's the problem with unbroken land?" he said. "Breaking it takes a full season, maybe more. I don't have another man. Lorne's been with me 4 years. He's worth 2 men for what he knows, but there are only so many hours," she said. "Lorne," he said, "he'll have seen us come over the rise by now. He watches for the wagon." As if answering, the barn door opened below them, and a figure came out into the yard, looked up toward the rise, and went back inside. He picked up the reins and they came down. Lorne was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 24. He had a serious face and careful eyes, and he met the wagon without hurrying. He looked at her with the frank evaluation of someone who does not have time to be indirect, then looked at the man beside her. He said, "North wall took some more yesterday. I've shored it with the post timber, but it won't hold past spring." The man said, "I know, we'll talk about it." Lorne looked at her again. Not unfriendly, he said, "The coffee's on," and went back into the barn. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting. Inside, the house was cold in the way of houses that have been heated only for necessity and not for comfort. The stove in the kitchen was adequate, but the wood box was low. She noted the window above the dry sink faced north, which meant it caught no sun until the middle of summer. She noted the shelf above the stove held flour, salt, dried beans, a tin of lard, and a half-empty bag of oats. She noted the floor was swept. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and watched her look at things. She said, "The north-facing window is a problem in winter. Everything freezes on the sill." He said, "I've been putting rags along the bottom of it." She said, "That helps the draft but not the cold coming through the glass." He said, "I know. I haven't found a better answer." She said, "There are interior shutters you can build. 2 panels of wood with wool batting between. Close them at dark. Open them for the light." He looked at the window. He said, "I hadn't thought of that." She began building the fire. He said, "You don't have to," she said. "The wood box needs filling regardless." He went out and came back with wood. By the time he had filled the box, she had the fire laid and the water heating. She found oats on the shelf and set a pot. He did not tell her where things were. He let her find them, and she appreciated that. Being shown where things are, as if you cannot locate a spoon, was its own kind of condescension. Lorne came in from the barn when the smell reached the yard. He took off his boots at the door and sat at the table and looked at the pot on the stove with an expression she could not quite interpret. She said, "It'll be a few minutes," he said. "I know how long oats take," she said. "Then you know when to come back." Something shifted in his face. He stayed at the table. She set bowls out when the oats were ready. The man came in from outside, washed his hands at the basin, sat with his back to the wall facing the door. She noticed that, old habit. She put a bowl in front of him and one in front of Lorne, and then she sat at the end of the table with the third. They ate without ceremony. Lorne had 2 bowls. He didn't thank her. He said when he was done, "Better than nothing," and took his bowl to the basin, rinsed it, and went back out. She considered that equal to a great compliment under the circumstances. The man said, "He's not unfriendly." She said, "I know, he's efficient." Something in his expression shifted, brief and then gone. After breakfast, he took her to see the 2 unbroken quarters. They drove east, away from the farm buildings, along the fence line that marked the edge of what had been cleared. Beyond the last fence post, the land changed. The grass was long and matted from the winter, pale and pressed flat, the seed heads still visible under the frost. She could see where the topsoil lay deep. There was a particular darkness to it, even under snow, and where it thinned toward the northeast corner and would want watching. She said, "What did you intend to put in?" He said, "Wheat, same as the rest." She said, "Both quarters." He said, "Why not?" She looked at the northeast corner. She said, "That corner drains toward the creek. If you put it all in wheat and have a wet June, you'll lose that section before you can get in to work it. 40 acres or more." He said, "How can you tell?" She said, "The way the land sits, and the grass is different there. Wetter rooted, it holds the melt longer." He looked where she was looking. He said, "My father always said the same about that corner." She said, "What did your father do with it?" He said, "He didn't live to put it in." She stood at the fence line and looked out for a moment. The sky was starting to move in the northwest, the flat white giving way to something with more weight behind it. She said, "You could put that corner in oats. Oats tolerate wet better. Rotate it back to wheat in 3 years once you've got the drainage improved." He said, "I don't know that much about oats." She said, "I grew up on a mixed farm in Pictou County. We ran oats on every low field we had." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Nova Scotia." She said, "Yes." He said, "Long way to come." She said, "I had reasons." He did not ask what they were. They drove back to the farmyard and stood by the barn while he thought. She could see him thinking. It was not the restless kind of thinking that needed to move through speaking. It was quiet and self-contained, and she recognized it because she did it herself. He said, "There's a room off the kitchen, east-facing. You'd have the morning light." She thought about the room. She thought about the north window and the interior shutters and the sweep floor and the man who had said you should see it before you decide. She said, "I'd want to see the spring before I made any decision about the 2 new quarters." He said, "That's fair," she said, "and Lorne would need to know what his situation is. If I'm managing the household and you're both out on the land, there needs to be an understanding about what's expected and from whom." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I hadn't thought to arrange it that way." She said, "Most people don't until it becomes a problem." He said, "I'll speak with him." She came back at the end of March. The snow was going by then, going the way it goes on the prairie, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving the north faces white until well into April. The road was soft where the frost had come out of it, and the wagon moved in the particular lurching way of spring roads, down into the mud and up out of it. She had everything she owned in a trunk and a canvas bag, and she did not think too much about what that said about the last several years. Lorne met them in the yard. He had been breaking the south edge of one of the new quarters with the team, and he came in covered in the particular black of freshly turned prairie sod. He looked at the trunk. He said, "I'll get the north wall done by end of April." She said, "I know you will." He looked at her in a way that was, she thought, close to approval. He went back to the field. The house was colder than she'd remembered, and the wood box was low again. She did not say anything about it. She built the fire and opened the north window to air the kitchen, and then she unpacked what she needed and put it where it belonged. Her tin of salt on the windowsill, her bone-handled knife on the shelf above the dry sink, her sewing case on the table where the light was best. She had learned over the years that the first hour in a new place was for establishing where things went, and not for anything else. Everything after was easier if the first hour was done correctly. That evening she found the ledger. It was on the shelf above the kitchen table, a thick book with a cracked spine, and she pulled it down and opened it expecting household accounts, and found instead a record of the farm going back to 1883, seeding dates, yields, weather notes, expenditures, the purchases of land, the names of animals bought and sold. His father's hand at the beginning, angular and certain. Then a gap of 2 years. Then a different hand, smaller, a woman's hand she thought, careful and consistent through 4 seasons. Then another gap. Then his hand, less even, sometimes in pencil, entries getting shorter. The last entry was from October. It said, brought in 1,840 bushels. Down from last year, dry August. Will try the Eastfield fallow next season. That was all. She sat with the ledger a while. She was not reading it so much as taking the measure of it. A farm that had been recorded this carefully for this long was a farm that someone had believed in. The gaps told you as much as the entries. She put it back on the shelf. He came in from the barn at full dark. He hung his coat and washed his hands and saw the ledger on the shelf. He looked at it and then at her, and she thought he might say something about it. But he didn't. He sat down and she put food on the table, and they ate in the quiet that was becoming familiar. She said, "You left the Eastfield fallow?" He said, "I thought I'd rest it." She said, "How many years?" He said, "This'll be the second." She said, "That's about right. It'll want working in late May, before the ground gets hard." He said, "I know when to work it." She said, "I know you know." He looked at her across the table, not offended, recalibrating. She went back to eating. Spring came on fast and with a particular insistence she had not seen in Nova Scotia, where the seasons negotiated. Here the land simply changed its mind. By the second week of April, the mud had firmed, the south pasture was showing green, and Lorne had the north wall rebuilt with timber he'd ordered in February and stored in the barn. She had not asked him about the wall since the first day. He had not mentioned it. One morning it was done. She started in on the garden the third week of April. Not a kitchen garden only. She laid out a full acre south of the house, in the sheltered ground between the barn and the fence line, where the soil had been enriched by years of runoff from the barn. She didn't ask permission for the acre. She staked it and dug it, and he came out one evening and stood at the edge of it and looked at the size of it. He said, "That's a large garden," she said. "It's not for this year. The first season is for building the soil," he said. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean, I'm going to plant things in it that you won't eat. Clover and rye and some legumes along the west edge. When you turn it under in the fall, the soil will be different," he said. "Different how?" she said. "Richer. The legumes fix something in the soil that wheat takes out. Your father would have known this." He stood there a moment. He said, "He did, I think. There was a field he always kept in clover." She said, "Which one?" He pointed to the field that ran north of the creek. She had noticed that field. It was a different color than the surrounding ones, darker, the way soil is darker when it has been tended rather than just worked. She said, "That's the field I'd put the oats in first. The soil's ready for it." He looked at the field. He looked at the garden. He looked at her in the way she was learning to recognize. Not a look that preceded words, just a way of taking something in. He went back to the barn. In May, a letter came from a man named Bretchen in the neighboring township, who had heard through some channel or other that the South Quarter was going in oats, and who wanted to know if there was any interest in sharing a threshing crew in the fall. She wrote back that there was. She showed the letter to him before she sent it, and he read it and handed it back without changing anything. She noted that Lorne's younger brother Wes arrived in June to help with the seeding of the 2 new quarters. He was quieter than Lorne, which she had not thought possible, and he worked with a steadiness that reminded her of a clock. She fed him at the table, and he ate everything she put in front of him, and once, just once, said the biscuits were the best he'd had since his mother's. She said, "They're your mother's recipe," because Lorne had told her without being asked the first week she'd arrived. Wes looked at her and then at Lorne. Lorne shrugged. Something settled in the kitchen after that. June was dry in a way that had a feeling behind it. She had learned in her second week to watch the northwest corner of the sky at dusk, and by the third week of June, she had started carrying 2 extra pails from the well each morning and filling the root cellar casks. He noticed. He said, "You think it's going to hold dry?" She said, "I don't know, but the casks are easy to fill when the well is high." He said nothing to that. In July, the creek dropped 8 inches in 3 weeks. The well held. The casks were full. She rotated the milk cows to the creek pasture at the end of July, keeping them off the north field where the oats were heading out. He had not told her to do this. She had looked at the field one morning and looked at the cows and made the calculation herself. When he came in from the east quarter that afternoon, he stood at the gate and looked at the empty north pasture, and then looked at the cows near the creek, and then came to the house. He said, "When did you move them?" She said, "This morning." He said, "I would have done it Tuesday." She said, "I know. I did it Monday." He looked at her. There was something in his face she did not try to read too precisely. He said, "The oats look good," she said. "They do." He poured his own coffee and sat at the table. She was at the window with the accounts book, the real accounts, the ones she had started keeping in May in a new ledger she had bought from the general store in town on her first trip in. He looked at the ledger. He said, "You been doing the books?" She said, "Someone should." He said, "I do them." She said, "You do them in October. I've been doing them as we go." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I see them?" She put the ledger on the table in front of him. He read for several minutes without speaking. She went back to the window. Outside, the light had gone golden the way it goes in July, when the day is ending well. The long horizontal light that made everything on the prairie look like something worth remembering. The oats in the north field moved in a slow wave. She could see Wes's hat above the fence line on the east quarter, just the hat, the rest of him below the grade. He said behind her, "You've broken the seed costs out by field." She said, "It's easier to see what's working that way." He said, "I never did it that way." She said, "I know." He said, "This is better." She did not make anything of it. She filed it away the way she filed most things, not as evidence of something larger, just as a fact. He had said it and she had heard it, and that was enough. Harvest came in a cool September, the kind that farmers remember as lucky. Brechen's crew arrived on a Wednesday, and they worked the farm for 4 days running, threshing the wheat and the oats and the East Field rye that she had decided in July to put in as a late trial. The crew ate at the table in shifts. She cooked from before light until full dark, and Wes helped her without being asked, managing the bread and the stew while she handled the meat and the pies. He said nothing about it being women's work. She had thought he might. He did not. On the last day of harvest, when the crew had gone and the yard was quiet again, she sat on the step in the cooling evening and did the numbers in her head before she did them in the book. She was not wrong often. He came and sat on the step beside her. They had been in the same house for 6 months, and this was the first time they had sat outside together without being in the middle of doing something. She was aware of it. She thought he was too. He said, "The oats yielded better than the wheat." She said, "This year they did. The soil in that field was ready for it." He said, "What do you do with that field next year?" She said, "Put it back in wheat. 2 years oats is enough, the nitrogen's in." He said, "And the new quarters." She said, "The southeast corner came in well, the northeast corner." She paused. "It held up better than I thought. You'll want to watch it in a wet spring, but it's not as bad as it looked in February." He said, "You were worried about it." She said, "I was paying attention to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I want to show you." He went inside and came back with the old ledger, the one with the cracked spine, the one she had taken down from the shelf in her first week. He opened it to one of the pages in the middle section, the careful woman's hand. He held it toward her. In the margin, beside a note about the North Field clover, someone had written in very small letters, "This field will outlast all the others if treated well." She looked at it for a long time. He said, "My wife wrote that in 1891. She said she was right." He said, "The North Field is the one you put the oats in." She said, "I know." She handed the ledger back. She looked out at the field, which was stubble now, pale gold in the evening light, the cut stalks catching the last of the sun. She said, she knew her land. He said she did. They sat there until the light went. He did not say anything more about it, and neither did she. It was not a thing that needed more words put to it. In October, the territorial paper ran a short notice about the harvest numbers from the valley, listing several farms by yield. The farm was listed with his name and the acreage, and the bushel count, which they had mostly right. Her name was not in it. She cut the notice out and put it in the back of the new ledger, in the section where she tracked the field-by-field yields, and beside it she wrote in pencil, "Northeast corner, 38 acres, 1,210 bushels oats. Watch drainage in May." He found it there the following spring when he came to check the seeding plan. He read it. He did not comment on the newspaper clipping. He read the notes in the margin, all of them, the ones going back to March. He stood at the table for a long time with the ledger open. Then he set it back on the shelf and went out to the barn. That afternoon, without anything having been said, Lorne rode into town and came back with a second rocking chair for the porch, strapped across the back of his horse with a good deal of difficulty and a great deal of creative rope work. He set it beside the first one without ceremony and went back to the barn. She was in the yard when he rode in. She looked at the chair. She looked at Lorne. He did not look back at her. She looked at the house. He was standing in the doorway. He met her eyes for a moment, then looked out past her at the south field, where the new wheat was just beginning to show above the turned earth, a faint green barely visible from this distance, the color of something beginning. She sat in the new chair that evening. He sat in the other one. The prairie ran out from the edge of the porch in every direction, and the sky above it had gone the pink and copper of a clear April evening. Somewhere to the south, a meadowlark was working through its song, not hurrying, the way meadowlarks do when the evening is long enough to take its time. They stayed until the stars came.